Well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to this week's Morning Coffee and a Thought, brought to you by Wings of Faith Ministries here in Sarnia, Ontario. It's good to be with you. I've got my coffee. I hope you have yours. This morning, I want to take a look at a phrase, or we could say a command, that appears twice in the scriptures of the Bible. The phrase is, "Come out of her, my people." It appears in Jeremiah 51 and also in Revelation chapter 18. We want to look at the context around this phrase in both passages in the Bible, and then kind of glean from that what all of that might mean for us today in 2025. First of all, before we go there, I'd like to relay to you that Wings of Faith Ministries can be seen on our YouTube channel every Friday beginning at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and on our Facebook page beginning at 8 a.m. on Sunday mornings. And we hope you will join us. And if our thoughts minister to you on our YouTube channel, we hope that you will subscribe or like the videos. And we hope that you will join us each week. Also, if you have a prayer request, if you want information or you want to make a donation to this ministry, you can do all of that at wingsoffaithministries.ca. Now let's get back to our thought. Back in 722 BCE, the northern 10 tribes of Israel are subjugated and many of the people deported during the time of the Assyrian Empire. And so those 10 tribes are now lost and mingled in with the surrounding nations that have been conquered by Assyria. 70 years after that deportation, around 650 BCE, the prophet Jeremiah is born, and he will go into ministry at the age of about 18 or 19 years old. So he's very young when he goes into the ministry. King Josiah is the king at the time that Jeremiah will begin his ministry. And Josiah is right in the middle of a reform campaign. Josiah wants to return the people of Israel back to the worship of their God Yahweh. The nation has long since strayed and adhered to Baal worship primarily, although there were probably many gods besides Baal's that they worshipped. And so Josiah began this reform project, trying to turn the nation back to God. Jeremiah, also as a prophet, was now prophesying to the people of Israel, urging them, the same way as Josiah was, to return back to Yahweh. But both Josiah's reforms and Jeremiah's messages in the long term fell on deaf ears. As Jeremiah got older, the nation simply strayed farther from their God. And so in 597 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, which was now the overriding power in the area, took Jerusalem and deported 7,000 Jews into the Babylonian Empire. Now these were the upper classes, the social classes of Israel. And so in 597, they are now deported into different areas of Babylon. Now the prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 29, sends a letter to the exiles that have been deported. And he says to them that their deportation is going to last for 70 years. He says to them, you might as well build homes, plant gardens, have marriages, because you're not going to come back anytime soon, even though prophets among them told them something different. So he was basically telling them to settle in to their life in Babylon. They were going to be there for a while. Just take up residence and pray for these cities that they were in, that they might prosper, and that God would be with them in their exile. But later in Jeremiah 51, Jeremiah will give them a completely different message. Now, this will be later, and Jeremiah will now tell them to come out from the people of Babylon. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, as they settled in to the Babylonian Empire, many Jews would have maybe forsaken their Jewish customs and taken on Babylonian lifestyle and their deity worship. In other words, many of the Jewish people would have taken on the culture and the lifestyle of the people around them in Babylonia. Jeremiah knew that God was going to pronounce judgment on Babylonia, which he would bring to pass in 539 BCE, when the Persians would take over. But he was warning them that before this judgment came, it was time for them to separate themselves. In other words, get back to the worship of Yahweh, get back to their Jewish roots, and don't be a partaker in the sins of Babylon. In other words, the worship of false gods, their social habits, the culture of Babylon. Jeremiah was calling for them to kind of put that behind them and get ready that God was going to pronounce judgment on Babylon, and that the Jews would soon have an opportunity under the new Persian Empire and Cyrus to return home. And so that's the warning that's given to the Jews in Babylon. Separate yourselves from the population, return to the worship of Yahweh and your Jewish roots, and get ready, because a judgment is coming. Now, as we said, this phrase will occur again hundreds of years later in the book of Revelation. Jesus' disciple John, now in his old age, writes to the 7 churches located in Asia Minor, those who had become believers in Jesus Christ. And he sends out the same warning for them in his letter of Revelation. He says to them to come out from the Roman Empire. In other words, he was writing his churches that they needed to put a distance between themselves and the lifestyle that people were living in the Roman Empire. The worship of their gods, their emperor worship, their lifestyle and culture. John was warning the churches that judgment was about to come to Rome, that Christ was there with them and would judge them unless they separated themselves from the population around them. It is true that when we are residents of a community, it is very easy to take on the attitudes, the lifestyle, and even the worship of the people around us. And that's what was happening both in Babylon and in the Roman Empire that John writes to in probably 80 or 90 AD. He is writing to a people warning them to come out from the practices, the lifestyle, the worship, and the culture and economy of Babylon, and to separate themselves and devote their loyalty to Jesus Christ, and not to the culture, the Roman culture around them. So What does all that have to do with us here today, living in Canada in 2025? Well, we could look at it the same way. We as believers in Christ have taken residence here in the world. Jesus would tell the Father in his prayer in John 17, I'm not asking you to take my followers out of the world. In other words, Jesus had called those disciples out of the world, but they were still going to live in the world. We as believers in Christ live in this world. We have jobs, we have families, we have homes, we have all sorts of activities that we're involved with. But the question becomes the same question in Jeremiah 51 and in John 18. Where are our hearts? What are we devoted to? Are we devoted to the lifestyle, the culture, all the thinking that goes on around us in the world that we live in? Or are our hearts and minds devoted to Jesus Christ and carrying out the plans and the purposes of God? That's what the prophet Jeremiah was talking about to the Jewish people back in 539 BCE. Who are you devoted to? To Babylon or to Yahweh? That's what John was talking about in Revelation. Who are you devoted to? To the Roman Empire or to Jesus Christ? And today we can ask ourselves the same question. Who are we devoted to? Who are our hearts tied to? Are we caught up with the spirit of this world that we live in? Or are we caught up with our worship and devotion with Jesus Christ and carrying out his purpose in our lives? The command, come out from her, my people, do not share in her sins, is as relevant today as it was back in 539 BCE or 80 or 90 AD, with both Jeremiah and John calling out the worshipers of Yahweh and Jesus Christ. Today, we as Christ worshipers need the same warning. We need to separate our devotion from the things of this life and this world and center that devotion on Jesus Christ. That's my thought for this morning. Listen, have a good day, enjoy your coffee, and we'll see you again next week.